Howdy, folks. Today we're diving into the art of photographing people. What really makes a portrait powerful? Is it the lighting, the pose, the connection with the subject, or is it something far less obvious? We're unpacking all of that and more right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise that's simply not available anywhere else. And as always, I'm your host, Kersten Luts. And if you're anything like me and you enjoy free podcast and YouTube content, you can help support the show by buying us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake, helping us keep creating more exciting episodes for you. And I love coffee, as you well know by now. So yeah, just head over there. But of course, you're more than welcome to say no thanks, no hard feelings at all. Just know that your support really does make a difference. And while you're at it, don't forget that official Camera Shake merch is now available over at camerashakepodcast.com. So if you fancy wrapping the show while out on shoots, we've got you covered. Now, today's guest is a photographer, educator, author, and someone who has spent years helping photographers better understand not just the technical side of portraiture, but the human side too. From posing and lighting to psychology and connection, his work has influenced photographers around the world, particularly when it comes to photographing people with confidence, impact, and purpose. So without further ado, let's give it up for today's special guest, Jeff Rojas. Jeff, man, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. Jeff, you're coming to us from the cold climates of Connecticut.
Cold Clams, Connecticut. Although most of my business is based in New York, or to the city, but yes, frozen in Connecticut right now.
Yeah, because you used to be very much part of the New York scene. Let's say. What
Yeah.
brought you out to Connecticut?
Peace. I mean, that's the short answer. I think when you live in that city long enough, and I was born and raised in New York City, outside of a small stint in Florida, you start craving peace. Just a lot of chaos that goes on in that small city. So,
Yeah, I get you because I used to live in London proper, and I made it out to the suburbs only a little while ago, so I fully understand where you're coming from. Jeff, when you look at a portrait that really stops you in your tracks, what is it that makes a portrait a powerful portrait? What is the secret juice, the secret ingredient?
I think the hardest thing for photographers is being able to capture a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional medium. Right. So anytime I can see depth and texture and tones, that's something that's interesting to me. I think a lot of photos today fall very flat. We're seeing them on screen, we're seeing them on our iPhones, right? Even in print, it's a very flat medium. So anytime there's depth there, that's interesting to me.
Do you think what makes a great portrait is that more about like technical skill, like lighting and so on, or is it more about emotional connection, or is it something else entirely?
For me, it's the connection side of things. So I always go back to this video I had seen of Annie Leibovitz about 12 years ago. And she's photographing Keith Richards for, I believe, Louis Vuitton. And it's for an editorial. And you have somebody who's arguably one of the best living photographers in the world, who is working with one of the most iconic rock and roll, icons in the world. And whereas we in the educational space would sit there and coach on hand position, hand movement, and this is where your shoulders should be positioned, this is where your chin should be positioned. She focused on connection, and she focused on capturing him for who he was. In fact, he started posing, and at some point she pushes back and she goes, Keith, just be you, play the guitar. My job is to effectively, take the images. For me, it's not about the full posing of the subject. You have to build that rapport with the person to get something that is in the moment, and being able to capture that emotion in its realism. Like that to me is incredibly valuable. And I think that's a lost art for a lot of photographers.
When was that point in your own career or in your life where a portrait became just that that something more other than, figuring out how to light somebody?
A few years, I would probably say about 8 years into a career at that point, because you start really when you get into a educational space, you look at what everyone else is doing, you're like, "I love that, let me try this. I love that, let me try this." And at some point, I was working with a client. I had just realized they were being nervous in terms of taking that shot, and I just put my camera to the side, built a conversation, built a dialogue, and at some point, I just picked up the camera and took a photo, like a snapshot. And I realized for most of my clients, if they're not models, it feels like being in front of an audience of 35,000 people being in front of a camera. And so if you want to build that genuine connection, the photo comes second to building that rapport with that person. And that was kind of a clicking moment to say, you know what, I need to look at things differently.
That rapport thing is actually a super important thing. I've noticed that, or the thing, let's put it this way. I think the way I've learned that is through commercial headshots, because the people that come in to have their headshot taken are not professional models. They're not used to being in front of the camera. They're not used to being in this situation, having a massive lens in front of them, lights, and all the rest of it. And so I sort of learned the hard way that, it's well worth spending some time just connecting to start with to make somebody feel comfortable and relaxed, you know, um, before you actually get to the shooting part. And even then, I always give it a good half an hour or something before I actually get to the good stuff. I always realize that the first, I don't know, whatever, 100 shots or something are going to be throwaways, you know, until my clients feel comfortable enough in front of the camera to actually look relaxed. And that's when I feel I get the best results.
When you're working with people, I think what winds up happening is we work in the world of digital photography, right? So there's really no cost to taking a second photo or a third photo. I mean, there's depreciation on the camera for sure, right? And eventually the shutter will break depending on how many shutter clicks you have, right? That's one part. But if you look at the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, you really had film, and you've had 10 to 15 shots at maximum to get the image that you were looking for, right? Even if you went through several rolls, it would still take you arguably a long time before you get to the volume that you just described, which is the first 100 photos, which is mind blowing about back then, right? So you had to build a better connection, you had to be purposeful, and you had to focus in on the shot, rather than quote unquote spraying and praying and kind of wishing for the best. So I think building a rapport is a lost art, and building a purposeful shot is also a lost art.
Can you tell when somebody walks in, like, can you tell within, I don't know, within the first minute or so, what kind of direction somebody will need?
I think photography is really about people, right? So my job is to understand the person that's in front of my lens in many ways, not unlike a hairstylist or a nail technician. Very much a couch therapist, if that makes any sense. So my job is to better understand, like, who's the person in front of me. What makes them click? Where do they feel uncomfortable, right? So even something so simple as people making fun of themselves, like men generally don't express their displeasures about themselves. But when it comes to things that they're not happy about, they might poke fun at themselves. And you listen to those things and you go, that's something that bothers them. So for example, men who are follically challenged, like if you don't have a ton of hair and that's something that's bothering you, one of the things that you listen to is like, make sure it doesn't shine up top. And you already know that somewhere deep down they're thinking about those things, right? So how do you balance for that? So you're listening and you're just getting to know who your subject is, right? At the end of the day, it's you have to build a rapport with somebody, which is incredibly valuable.
What do you think most people get wrong when they're trying to connect um, with a subject?
Um, I've seen people ask some pretty awkward questions. I don't think everyone's inevitably a people person, but I think if you spend more time asking questions than you do speaking, and asking questions about the person from a perspective of like what makes them tick instead of the life goings in their family and their day to day, you'd see a difference in their reaction, right? Because if you're having a hard day and I start talking about that hard day, it's very different than asking, what you're passionate about or what you're focused on in the next few years or what you're building towards. those will um, those will produce very different reactions throughout the entire shoot. So you have to be able to navigate the conversation in a meaningful way towards getting the image that you're looking for. I would rather photograph somebody who was just speaking about their life passions as opposed to the fact that like they might lose their house, next week. Those are things that you learn along the way.
It's sometimes quite difficult. I mean, especially, and I'm completely generalizing here, by the way. So anybody listening in the UK, it's not as bad as it sounds. But generally speaking, in the UK, people tend to um, respond with, I think, a lot more of a reserved manner. If and that can come across as negativity. Like a good example is, when you ask somebody like, "How are you doing?" The standard answer would be not too bad. It's not like, "Oh, I'm doing great. I'm good." It's like not too bad. And in my European brain, I'm always thinking, not too bad. So it's bad, but it's not too bad. How bad is it? you know,
Yeah.
it's it's just like it's a sort of a mindset thing. Do you think it's I mean, does it help if you're as a photographer, if you're naturally more of an extrovert person? And I know what a lot of people will be thinking is, is that something you can learn? Is that something you can ad- adopt? The ability to connect with somebody, and how do you get there?
So I think for me, it's about genuine curiosity as a person. I'm a natural introvert. So I'm an extroverted introvert is the way I like to describe it as. I can go on stage and I can go speak, and the second that happens and I'm off that stage, I'm gonna go disappear somewhere. Right. So I'm gonna go back to my house, not want to talk to anybody for 3 days, that kind of thing. But I'm genuinely curious about people. Like that to me matters. I want to know what makes you tick, how you got to this point, the things that went on in your life. I mean, when we first jumped onto this call, the first couple questions was like, where are you from? How'd you get there? Those types of questions. And that's not because I'm trying to feign interest. It's because I'm genuinely curious about the person in front of me. I honestly think the most important skill set anybody can have in life if they want to grow, to build, to do anything, is just to be curious. I think it's the most valuable thing that you can do as a human being.
Have you ever had a client or a subject where that just completely backfired and it just really didn't work at all?
Everybody has a couple, right? And so you look at those and you take them with a grain of salt, because if I took that into account versus the percentage that went well, it's a numbers game at that point.
Your style is really quite striking, and
Mm.
you've I think you've become particularly well known um, for photographing people, with confidence, um, and what's the best word? And in presence. Um,
Yeah.
what is your philosophy when it comes to posing somebody, for example, to express that confidence?
Yeah. So the things that drive, like, in terms of where I get my inspiration from, I love 50s, 60s, and 70s movies, right? That's like my favorite thing in the world.
Welcome to the
And
club,
so
man.
I love it. Love it.
Awesome.
When you looked at all photos of like James Dean or Steve McQueen, right? Let's say if you were photographing them, um, those are very different images compared to what you see on print covers today, right? So I always look at those old portraits and I go, what made those so profound? And it was a sense of confidence, and it was a sense of owning a space we don't really have right now. And so I try to mirror a lot of that in my photography, right? So if you're talking about somebody who is like a male subject who is sitting in a space, generally speaking, generally speaking, the more space you take up, it looks like you're more confident. It's the reason that you generally will slouch in a chair at home or slouch in your sofa, right? Because it's your thing. It's something that you possess. Whereas you're not going to do that in somebody's office because you know that that's not your your item, right? You own the space, right? So when someone feels comfortable, it's meaningful to take that into account. If they're comfortable in the space, they don't look so closed off and tight. They look like they're owning everything that's around them. And those are things that I'm constantly considering. If it was for women, very similar. They have to feel at ease more so than anything else, right? So if it's their space at home, they're going to let their hair down a little bit, right? In terms of how they're positioning themselves. No one's really uptight in those environments. So my job is to figure out how to connect its bridges, not to be super like fugazi about it, but those are the things I'm looking for.
One of the things I found really interesting, a little while ago, I got a book by Mark Vieira, and it's called Horrell's Hollywood. In fact, I had Mark on the show, talking about making that book, and it's all about the photography of George Horrell, like you know, um, portraiture from the golden age of Hollywood, basically. All the way from the late 20s, I would say, all the way through to the 50s, maybe. Um, and I was really struck by the posing, throughout those images, and again, they were taken in the 30s, 40s, and so there's really something, especially for women's poses, but also for the guys. There was, as you say, there was just so much more confidence in there. It's really striking, and I don't think that ever occurred to me until I really looked very closely at the images in the book, and there's hundreds and hundreds of images in the book. It's a fantastic book. I recommend it highly to anybody listening. But uh, and so one of the things I often think about is like what's the difference between, let's say, posing somebody and directing somebody, or is there a difference at all?
Yeah, I try not to pose anymore. Meaning I'm not, move this thumb that way, move this finger this way. This looks awkward, right? Because I think those look very contrived. And so my job is to direct and navigate, right? To pose like my subject, to walk them through that and make them feel confident with what I'm looking for. Not being afraid to show them the back of the camera to say, here's what I love, here's what we can change, here's where I think we can be better or get better. Like those are things that I'm considering. So you have to be able to, like a director in a movie, say, this is really what I'm looking for, right? Because you're leading them where they need to be as opposed to telling them what to do. I think that's the major difference.
So how do you do that? Do you give them a certain scenario, like a backstory, like you would do as a director with an actor, for example, where you give somebody like a backstory so they can understand where that person is coming from and how they would feel, or what's your
If it
how do you do it?
It's a great question. So if it's a subject who, let's say, a fashion shoot or a commercial set, right? What I'm looking for is, this is your space, you're owning it, you're the owner of XYZ, right? I'll do that narration. Because that's generally a paid model who understands what I'm looking for, right? That's your actor or actress. Very different when you're doing a portrait client, right? Throughout my portrait, the years of owning a portrait business, that's not going to work with your average client, right? So that's a different level of skill where I have to almost mirror what I'm looking for. So I'll do the poses myself, and have them replicate that, have a mirror in front of us for us to be able to replicate what we're looking for. Very different skill set, but still necessary skills that you have to understand depending on who you're working with, because not everybody understands your direction.
So I think for a lot of people, especially photographers who maybe at the beginning of their career in there, or maybe photographers who want to switch into portraiture and are trying to understand posing. I think one of the most important things is to understand where you go wrong to start with. What are some of the most common mistakes that people make initially when photographing humans?
Don't go to Pinterest and go look up contemporary things, because it's never going to generally work out. I'm very much a traditionalist. There was a time in the mid 2010s where like the broken doll pose was interesting to people, and I was like, what is that, right? And you never really saw that in old Hollywood, and if you did, it was an actress who was playing some sort of character in a specific way, right? So contemporary, everything that's new, I genuinely will stay away from. I love going back to those old traditions and old poses and the way that people reflected confidence back in the day, right? It's even the way you can dress. And I'm saying that because there's a correlation there. If you buy these loud, large prints that are, contemporary and brand new, they generally are dated in 2 or 3 years, right? And then if you buy pieces that are, let's say your jean jacket or grays, like those very neutral things. That allows you to take that, wear it for the next 10 years and still look like you're living in the present. Posing is very much the same way for me, right? I don't want to do anything that's too outlandish, that might not land well 5 years from now. I don't want to do those broken down poses. I don't want to do, weird parachute photography, like parachute dresses. That was a huge thing at some point. Um, those are things that I'm trying to avoid. I'm trying to stay to very traditional things. The worst thing as a photographer for me is looking back at my work 15 years ago and just cringing. It does. And I've had photos that I look back at and I was just like, why? And it's always the photos that I try to replicate something that was currently in style. And I was just like, yeah. Like I remember at some point I did a beauty shoot and there was a bunch of like bedazzled gems on somebody's face or something like that. And we ended up getting published, which I'm grateful for. But I look back at that and I was like, I hope no one ever sees that again.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. This is one of those things, I mean, if you're trying to chase the latest trend, you're inevitably always going to be behind. Are there any specific particular rules, in terms of like how to pose, hands, what are the things that people should be looking out for?
Just just go have fun, go learn what works and what doesn't. I've been shooting since I was 24. I just turned 38. Right. So that doesn't sound like a really long time, but in our world it is, right? In terms of what people are, sorry, I've been shooting since I was 22, something like that, whatever it was, whenever my first kid, that's 16 years. That's someone's life at this point. You go through that and you go through ebbs and flows of, I know everything, I don't know everything. And so I've written 2 textbooks on photography. I've written 2 other self-published books. I've traveled the world teaching for well over a decade at this point. And I feel like I don't know anything anymore. And I feel grateful for that, right? Because when you know everything, I think you work with that mindset. And inevitably, I think that is something that you're not able to grow from. You have to learn, go back to basics, the things that matter. So I encourage every new photographer, try new things, see what works well, see what doesn't work well. Don't start looking at other photographers as, the it, because it's great to have like references and try to figure out you can go in a specific route and direction and take influence from people and you learn from other people, but don't try to be anybody else. Right. So even through posing and figure out what works well with certain ones of your clients or your subjects and making them feel confident and learning how to speak to people in your own way, right? I think we've given everyone, I think in my career as an educator, guidelines, guardrails, and calculators that don't work for every single person. So I would hate to lead somebody who's just starting off in photography the wrong way and say, go to these 5 poses, this is what you need to do, because that might not work for them.
And you hear that a lot. I think in the educational, sphere, you do hear that a lot. Like these are your 5 go-to poses that you must master before you can move on to something else.
And I've done it myself. I mean, I'm guilty of the very same thing. Right? Go to these 5 poses, do these 5 things, have these 5 things. Do these 3. There's no calculator to success in that way. You have to figure out this is what worked for this person. It may not work for you. Right? I've seen photographers, for example, chase those trends. What winds up happening is that they never really develop their own style. They never really develop their own vision. and they're constantly mimicking others into a point where it's, they don't really run businesses. They don't have clients. They're just adapting and doing. And that's, where do you go from there? Right. And there's also something to say about like photographers and educators. I think there's a difference there, right? Professional photographers and professional educators as well. Like that's an entirely different conversation, but something still top of mind.
Do you think things like social media, Instagram, Pinterest, the ready availability of imagery, um, do you think that has benefited or maybe actually even distracted new photographers in a way? Because I'm thinking like I don't know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the 80s. Let's put it this way. And so,
You look
I
good, my
think
friend. If that's the case.
thanks, man. But back then, in a sense, in some ways, you had to be more creative in inverted commas because you just didn't have access to the same amount of imagery that you have now. You could buy Vogue and magazines and whatever, and you would see occasionally you would see something on like the 3 channels on TV that were there, but it wasn't like you could just jump onto Pinterest or design something in Chat GPT or use the Google machine to get flooded with those kind of with thousands upon thousands of images. Is it easier today or harder
Hmm.
to create your own or to build your own style?
So I'm gonna take that in a couple of different steps. Number one, AI has a specific look behind it, right? And so what winds up happening is, and this is coming from, just as an FYI for anyone who's listening that doesn't know my backstory or my history. I owned a production business for about 10 years. Simultaneously, at the end of that 10 years, I was working at Adobe as an engagement manager and then a go-to-market manager. So I was at the cusp of content velocity, the AI space, and things like that. And I've also worked in the CMS space, right? So this is coming from a business perspective as well, from an enterprise business perspective. What winds up happening with the average consumer as they're going to their phone is they're being desensitized to things that look very similar. Right. So as you think about what an AI image looks like, you're scrolling through Instagram, you're scrolling through Facebook, you're going to identify those pretty quickly, even if you're not recognizing that, and you're going to just scroll right past it. Right. You're gonna go, that looks like AI, even if you're not acknowledging it. Your brain is desensitized on information. And so that makes it incredibly important to stand out, because if you have that, and in addition to that, you have 1,000 people doing the same type of photography, people just scroll by. Like, your job as a content creator is to get them to stop on that single image and to engage and interact and want to see that specific one image. So I don't think there's a better time to come up with your own voice, your own vision, and a way to stand out in a very noisy market, right? We always hear signal versus noise. Your job is to provide signal to your audience and be able to get them to just look at that one piece of information. In fact, and I want to double down on this for a second. In fact, there was a study recently done where your average teenagers are now going back to things like analog, right, for their phones, which is wild to think about. And I think a lot of it has to do with how much like this floods our day-to-day brain and activity. You want to stand out in that market. You want to put yourself in a position where everyone could look at that one image and say, that's amazing. Who did that? That's hard to do in today's market, but it's incredibly important.
Is that what's driving that sort of resurgence of film and that whole kind of retro um, kind of vibe?
I think that's one aspect of it. I think, so as a person who, I heard this phrase the other day, born in the 80s, child of the 90s kind of thing. We're going back to that early 90s life again, is what it's starting to feel like, where it feels like the world's healing in a way. We're going back to the core basics. Like, kids are skateboarding now, and that stopped for a few years, right? That's interesting. Janko jeans, if you've ever wore those, are starting to come back.
Hey, I
Film
bought this jacket in 1990. Well, 89 maybe.
is no
So
way.
yeah.
There's no way. It looks
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
good.
It's the
I
same.
think I have the same.
Yes, exactly the same as it is now. Well,
I love that. It looks, that honestly has it's beautiful, right? And it's patinaed very, very well. I have one similar, and I don't think it'll ever last that long, right? And it's through Levi's, I believe, as well.
Yeah.
But it's all that stuff is coming back, and inevitably, what winds up happening as that's coming back is Polaroid started coming back. And if you remember just a few years ago, remember the cool pics from the 2000s?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Of course.
Yeah, we were out to I forgot where we dinner or somewhere, and everyone's using the cool pics again. And I was like, what is happening? Right, those trends are coming back. But I think because that becomes trendy, but at the same token, I think people are trying to remove themselves from the constant, feedback of all these different things. So yeah, I think in a way, it's helping push us in that direction.
It's interesting. I mean, I really am a in terms of photography, I'm a child of the digital age. But I did, and I've spoken about this many times on this podcast. I've recently gone back into film a couple of years
Mm,
ago, and I've really found that I found it hard. That's one thing; it's really difficult, but also strangely satisfying. Because it is so simple, because it's so basic, because everything takes so much longer. And that's not a negative. That's actually, in my view, a real positive, because it really snaps you out of that hustle bustle world of having to produce fast results. And, it really just slows you down, makes you stop and think
mm,
about every aspect of
I agree.
the image that you're taking. And I absolutely love that. And it's really sort of reinvigorated my love for photography. Not that it was waning in waning, whatever, in any way, shape, or form. But, I really, I love going out, and I know I have 12, well, really, 11 and a half shots, on a roll of film, and that's it, That's my afternoon in London, done. And it's beautiful, love it.
And think about that for a second. Like those 10 to 11 or 12 shots when you go outside, and at the end of the day, feel like it feels rewarding because you're like, I was able to capture things that really are meaningful to me versus like I remember being a kid and my grandmother getting disposable cameras. You didn't have 200 disposable cameras lying around. You got one if you could afford one, right? So we made the most of all the shots that you had. And I still cherish all those memories because they were intentional, right? I think that's the most important word here, which is intention. You're being like you having intention with the shot that you're going to take. I love that, and I picked up film. So I wasn't a child of film photography. I started during digital age, right? So it's 2008, 2009, whatever the era. No, sorry, 2010. I think I picked up my first camera. It's been a while. When I looked at that, I wish I had shot film because it slowed me down when I'd finally picked up a film camera and I had to start thinking through the shot. And I went into a studio. I put a Profoto trigger on top of a Canon AE1. Somehow it triggered the camera. I don't know how that happened, but it wound up triggering the camera. I don't know if I had it. Was it hot sync? Whatever the actual sync cord or whatnot. But getting a chance to do that in a studio environment and then getting to see those original negatives back and then getting to see the final prints back. There's just something different. There's just something different about that image. There's no software that could replicate that feel of a film image, a beautiful film image.
It's also the fact that you have to wait for it. I remember, when I was a kid, you had to go to, usually, well, either a photo studio to get your roles developed, or over here they had it in, they had like little photo booths in like pharmacies and things like that, so you could drop your rolls of film off, and then you would get it back a few days later. But there was always this delay between filling up the roll, and of course you could go out and take a few pictures, and you look at the camera and you're like, oh well, I still have like 16 shots left on my 36 image roll of 35 mil film or something. And then eventually, when it was time to get it developed, you couldn't just throw it on a computer and see the images. You had to go and have them developed, and it would take time. And I remember the anticipation, when you went back and they were ready, and you get the envelope with the prints in. There was something about that, even if it was just vacation images, even if it was just, I don't know, like a family occasion, whatever. Nothing didn't have to be anything special, but there was just still this anticipation. And I think I feel sometimes that there's something lost when you can have instant access to your images, which on one hand is of course beautiful and amazing, and how far has technology come and all the rest of it. But there's still, I don't know, there's this other element. To me, sometimes it feels like that anticipation that you have when you wait, like as a kid, you go to bed and it's like, you know, the night before Christmas Day, and you have this anticipation about what's going to happen the next morning, or like the night before your birthday or something like that. It's kind of, it's always a similar thing. I didn't really recognize that until much later, like until I was actually into photography.
Yeah,
I never really realized how important that was to me when I was younger. And so in some ways, you know, I miss that, a little bit.
I love that. It's a great way to put it. It's almost like opening up a Christmas photo for sure. The downside of that is when something's slightly out of focus and it
Yeah, right.
gives you, you know, trauma for a few years.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, there's so many. Of course, there's so many advantages of what we could do today. No doubt. But still, like, it's fun to me. Film photography is not something I do professionally at all. It's a pastime. It's a hobby if you want. It's just something that I do where I can just get into photography, and I don't have the pressure of having to think, oh my god, I hope the client loves it. It's just something I could do, and if it goes wrong, well, I've learned something. Or I try to figure it out anyway.
Can you imagine being a wedding photographer in 2026 and going back to film and that's your medium?
Oh my god. I mean, I honestly, I have the utmost respect for people who do that. I had a chat with Jerry Gionis, a while ago, and as we were chatting, he said like, "Oh, you know what? One of the challenging things I did was I went and shot a wedding on Polaroid."
Mm.
And I'm like, "Okay, well, I mean, I have the utmost respect for wedding photographers nowadays who do that still, and also for people who used to do that back in the 80s and 90s or
Yeah.
whatever." But to me, that is the ultimate nightmare, I think. Can you imagine, like, somebody goes like, "Oh, did you get the first kiss?" And you go, "Uh, I hope so." Oh my god.
A nightmare.
Completely.
A
Um,
nightmare for sure.
Now your book, Photographing Men, um,
Mhm.
became hugely influential, and, um, there's a number of questions I have there. One, when you wrote that book,
Mm.
what was the motivation, to focus on specifically photographing men?
Yeah, I think to the backstory. So I've said this a few times. I'm gonna kind of this will be my nail in the coffin in terms of that story for a reason. Um, I was on Creative Live, and I was behind the scenes listening to a couple of other instructors, and I'd gone to this one specific speaker who was speaking about wedding photography, and I loved his work. Um, you know what? I'm gonna call him out. I'm gonna call him out on this call. It's actually Jerry. So actually, it was in Jerry's class,
Okay.
and I was sitting behind the scenes, and he had done a wedding shoot, and he had a blonde, beautiful bride, and then he had a heavyset groom in the same photo, but he had hid the groom behind some brush. And I was like, why did he do that? And he's explaining, well, he was heavy and she was skinny and she was beautiful or whatever it was. So I like focused on her and less so on him. And I'm like, she married him, right? So like, why is that such an issue? She loves him for who he is, and then you as a photographer made a conscious decision to hide him because you felt a certain way about him. And that never sat well with me. And again, Jerry's a great guy, but in terms of growth, that's where I was in mindset. Like I just felt jaded by listening to that. And so I also, at the same time, looked at a book called, it was like 500 Poses for Posing Men or something along those lines. And I bought the book. And in the book, it was like a guy doing a karate pose of some sort as one of the poses. And I was like, what? Is this a joke to people at this point? Like, is this? And then the people around me, you have some really good guys in the world who always like making fun of themselves. And, we tease one another. I think as men, we generally go back to one another and we tease one another because it's funny. But I grew up, like my grandfather was like my dad in many different ways. So I'm always watching older movies. And when I say older movies, again, 40s, 50s, 60s, and horrible sci-fi channel movies, that's a different conversation for another day as well. But, the James Dean, the Steve McQueen, and Steve McQueen, I couldn't tell you how many times I looked at him on the screen. And I looked at the old photos of these guys, and they were just so, quote unquote, traditionally masculine in the way that they were presented. And if you study history and you look at the 60s, 70s into the 80s, that was pretty usual and typical. And then something happened between the 80s and 90s where you had very thin, quote unquote, traditionally effeminate men as your main subjects and models in the 90s.
Yeah.
It went from like Sylvester Stallone to somebody super skinny. Very different.
And the same thing happened in music, actually. If you think of the hair metal, glam metal kind of scene, virtually every album cover was a bunch of guys in a band who literally looked like women, like with full on makeup and permed hair, and the whole thing, really very very effeminate. But
Yeah.
it really was a complete turnaround from 10 years earlier, let's say.
Agreed. And that started influencing a lot of the way that models showed up in ad campaigns. And it wasn't again until I think his name is David Gandy or something like that. It's a male model where he was physically like jacked that things started to change around again. But all that to say is for a long time, that's what you got to see. And male portrait photography at that point was a joke. And then, the era that I was teaching and speaking around that time, no one really was taking it seriously. And I think all of that bothered me. And I saw an opportunity there from a business standpoint to go, well, if no one else is going to do this, then I'll do it. And I'll be the first person to speak about it. So I did an entire research project on the way that men think, the way that men operate, how they feel about themselves, how they're perceived in the marketplace. And I wanted to change that narrative. And that culminated into the book that is Photographing Men, which is, you know, one of my proudest things that I've done in my portrait photography career is write that book because I felt like I could give back to the world. And I saw people really taking male portrait photography seriously. And, it really influenced how grooms were photographed at weddings. I feel old enough to say I had somebody contact me years ago about my textbook being used in their like college dissertation at some art school. And I was like, don't ever say that again, because now I feel like I'm not 100 years old, right? So I'm grateful for but that's all it was. It was frustrations and um, looking at the market and seeing an opportunity and just building off of that. And that's really what the culmination of that book was.
So purely from a photographic perspective, what makes photographing men different from photographing women?
The the confidence, the posture, for me, it's about building the relationships in a meaningful way, right? I think I will sit and talk to just any guy and just have a direct conversation with that person. I'm not calling them pretty because that always feels awkward to say the least. You'll get a laugh out of them at best, but you want to make them feel comfortable and confident at the end of the day. And that looks like just hanging out with the boys, right? Even that's not just portrait clients. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had models on set that come in and being a heterosexual straight male, they feel safe in that environment because that's something else that no one really speaks about, which is how many of them are in very precarious and sometimes damaging situations, and so that also changes the way that they're approached on scene. They feel comfortable and they're willing to be on set, and they know that at the end of the day they're going to leave the apartment or whatever, the studio, unscathed, and that also plays a meaningful part of those things. So it's just making people feel comfortable and confident. That's all.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I just remembered something actually, because I'm old enough to remember this firsthand. And I remember the 80s were like it's a weird time because on one hand you had this this sort of femininity in male portraiture, but at the same time you also had these like classic masculine um examples. Like I was just thinking of Tom Selleck in Magnum PI, for instance, which is a very kind of a classic, almost like a 70s you know, example of masculinity.
Yeah, and but then you see the same person being on a bearskin rug with, nothing in front of him, right? In terms of that one iconic image, but that was meant in satire. It wasn't meant as his, like, general demeanor of what everybody remembers him as. But somehow we made that satire all of male portraiture at some point, and that's what I always strive to stray away from is I don't I take it seriously. It's not a joke to me, right? I was gonna photograph a wedding. The groom is just as important as the bride. I know it's quote unquote her day, but I also want to honor the people I'm photographing. They're not it's not a joke to me. And so I think that that's important to recognize as well.
Now, sometimes you look at a portrait and it's like technically perfect, but even when you look at technically perfect portraits, they can still feel lifeless sometimes. And now, how do you draw like a genuine expression out of somebody?
I can go the technical route and I can sit here and make sure you have catch lights in the eyes, make sure that you have some sort of expression around the eyes in terms of like the smize, if you want to call it that, because then that shows that they have an intention in the image. For me, it's about meaningful connection through the building confidence before you pick up that camera, right? Because then you're capturing who that person is. When you have hundreds of photos of the same smize, quote unquote, it's a great portrait, but it's not necessarily capturing who a person is. I want to capture, like, if I photograph somebody like my grandfather has never been one to sit here and pose. My grandfather worked with his hands. He worked manual labor all of his life. And so a portrait of my grandfather that really capture his essence is one where he's using his hands or using tools. And so it would be something like an environmental portraiture for me, because I know that that's something that, or a portrait of his hands, right? Or the weathering of his face and his sunken in eyes and those kind of things. But he's not going to sit there and smize. That's not who my grandfather is, right? So the same if I go to someone like my mom, I know who my mom is and I know her background and I know the things that are important to her and what matters to me is capturing her as who she is. I think what's meaningful for me is capturing people for who they are, not trying to pose them well. There's not a single, and I love somebody like Peter Hurley does incredibly well, and I love his portraits and I think they're beautiful. But are they actually capturing a person's soul and who they actually are? Right? That's very different than an image that's well lit or well composed. It very different circumstance. So I think for me, it's knowing your subject, knowing who they are, knowing what makes them who they are, and then being able to capture that.
There's always a thing, I think about when I think of professional headshots, and I should think about this because I've created a lot of them. But it's this thing whereby you sort of I sometimes wonder like whether you should try and capture somebody's personality in
Mm.
a headshot, or whether you should capture something that the person looking at the headshot wants to see, if that makes sense. You know, um,
Depends on context, right? So, like I said, like I mentioned before, a well lit, well composed shot is a great headshot, right? But is it a great portrait? And that's different, right? So it's a great execution. So if I'm an actor, I want to get a great headshot. But if I'm trying to show that I have personality, maybe I don't want a deadpan face because that doesn't necessarily lean well to somebody I should hire. So I think context and consumer is also important. Like what's the point of the photograph in the first place? A headshot isn't meant to build rapport with someone. It's meant to take an image and make sure that it's clean and sell a product, right? It's generally attached to a product or service or something that you're trying to promote. Whereas a portrait capturing someone's essence is very different. It's about capturing who they are and what they're about, and those kind of things.
and the way I always describe it is, a headshot is basically a portrait with a job, as a job to do. Like for an actor, the job is, well, when the casting director sees it, you want to get the audition, basically, you want to get hired ultimately, so it's always like, okay, well, how can we bring that across um, for that particular client? You know, it's always, I think, one of the examples I normally give is like, imagine the difference between photographing like a nurse and
Mm.
um, a lawyer. These are completely different professions. One is people facing, and you need to make sure that you're what's the word that people can connect with you and people can
Yeah.
come up to you, and whilst as a lawyer you need to come across as if you can get the job done. So it's a completely different.
Well, let's put it like this, and I'll make this even easier in terms of the way that my brain operates. Irving Penn is my favorite photographer, right? Beautiful imagery while he was alive, and he's probably the person I pull the most inspiration from in my life. But if Irving Penn were to photograph a nurse and she were to use that on her LinkedIn profile, it wouldn't look professional,
That's good. That's a good thought.
right? And he was an amazing photographer, but it doesn't serve the purpose well. So there's a purpose behind every single image you take.
Do you do you direct expression sort of explicitly, or do you create more of a like a moment, for that expression to occur?
For me, it's about the moment more than anything else. It's going back to the Annie Leibovitz example that I gave you before. It's you're waiting for that one particular moment. If we were shooting film, I'm waiting for that moment. I'm not, forcing the moment. Because my job is to capture a person for who they are. It's not a contrived expression. I've never, as good as okay. Let's take 3 steps back. Um, what is the most iconic headshot that you can remember?
Well, generally,
Yeah,
that's a good question.
let's try that again. What's the most iconic portrait you've ever seen?
Iconic is a difficult word because iconic in my head means a number of different things. I can take I can take that book that I mentioned, George Orwell's Hollywood, and there's so many iconic headshot stroke portraits in there, from Clark Gable to Gregory Peck to, I mean, it's limitless. And I tell you what, I remember talking about another book. When I was a kid, my dad, who was a photographer also, we had a coffee table book just lying around, and it was um, by C.S. Bull. And it was basically very similar. It was, headshots or portraits from the early days, the golden age of Hollywood, some of his work. And I remember being fascinated by that when I was a kid. I was fascinated by, well, the fact that it was all black and white, the lighting, the expression, there was just something, the style. It was just so stylish, you know, like, I love the hard light, the play between light and shadow, the subjects or the actors' expressions, and some of them were, of course, very, very famous actors. But I could describe every single shot in that book as being iconic from where I was, from where I grew up in the south of Germany in like a wine region. you know, like
Well,
that to me was like
let's take that example for example. We mentioned before. So if you put the definition behind a headshot as selling a product or service, how many of those were selling products or services?
for my clients.
No, no, for that book that you're
Oh, for that
describing.
book, they were all actors, so they were all selling themselves in a way. Well, two things actually, they were either selling themselves or they were selling a movie because a lot of those shots were done in connection in order to promote, a particular movie.
But when you talk about the icon, right, and we're talking about something that is meaningful and impactful in the course of life. If I think of somebody like, I don't know, Steve Jobs, the first photo I think of him is the one that, what's his name? He frequents my small town quite a bit, and I spoke on stage with him. I forgot his name, but it's the famous photo of Steve Jobs in black and white, right?
Oh, really? Yeah.
Not not a headshot, definitely a portrait in the way that that's taken. If I remember all the photos of every single icon, think of Mike Tyson, think of Michael Jordan, think of Michael Jackson, think of Burt Reynolds, would you say that you remember their portraits more or their headshots more? It's one thing to have a niche like thing that you love, but most people don't remember headshots. They remember portraits. I
That's
hate to
very
say that, but that's how the market works. We remember iconic portraits.
And the thing I often think when I see modern headshots, um, is that in my head, I compare it back to that initial book that I mentioned, the book by C.S. Bull. Um, that I often think that the iconicness, whatever the word, the noun is, um, has sort of disappeared from headshots. Like
Mm,
your run of the mill 9 to 5, 20-minute in and out headshot that appears on somebody's staff page on their website, or
mm,
there's just so little of that
mm,
left. Because you look at like older um headshots.
mm,
I think they would nowadays they would stand out as portraits, by that definition, because the lighting would have been so good, the posing would have been so good, that would just like reflect something completely different. Um, I actually, in fact, I remember seeing headshots from my grandma, who also was a photographer, incidentally, back from 1938, like,
mm.
all black and white. I saw some of the original prints, which were kept in a book, and amazingly were pristine to the point where you thought they were printed yesterday. I mean, it's unbelievable. You know,
That's
they
amazing.
were rich, sharp. Not what you'd expect a print that's over 80 years old to look like. They looked brand new. So actually, I was flabbergasted because I never realized how I don't know, maybe I never really understood how good the quality of print actually was back in those days. I think we often have this sort of misconception that we think like, oh, technology has come on such a long way, and back then everything was rubbish, and now it's all great. But they were so well lit, so well executed that
Yeah.
to me they were fantastic portraits.
Because they had intention, right? Is what we described
Absolutely,
before.
yeah.
And so now a headshot for a lot of people is I'm going to go use natural light. I'm going to go shoot you on a white wall. This is what you need, right? And there's no art there at all. And it's funny that that's where we are in society now, which is I could do flash on camera, call it a headshot, call it a day, right? I could do natural light on a wall, and if it's beautiful, great. If it's art, great. But it's not memorable. How do you take something that is memorable? We lost a lot of that art. I mean, I would say that the art gets lost when you build out systems. And so you have all these instructors that'll go on stage and say, here's your 3 light setup. Here's everything that you need to run a business. And are you gonna make money? Yeah, you're gonna crank out volume-based business for sure. But is what you're creating art?
That may just be the thing that will save us from AI. Yeah,
Yeah, I agree.
artist, I
I agree.
regret. But let's talk lighting a little bit. How much of a portrait, let's put it this way, how much of a portrait's of emotional impact, if you want, comes down to the light?
So here's my thought process on lighting. You should know your art enough to focus on your subject, not on the lighting technique. Okay. I don't I don't go into like in any other world, we in any other profession, we don't talk about the tools that we're using. It's always about the artists behind it. It's always about the service that you're providing. I don't walk into Gordon Ramsay's restaurant and go, what kitchen are you using and how are you cooking at a specific temperature? And I want to know his thought process behind those things. Like that to me matters most. So lighting wise, for me, it's set it and forget it. Right. I prefer large, soft light sources, generally at a Rembrandt position, old school lighting, with more moody, dark backdrops, or lighting overhead and butterfly lighting. And I go back to those really foundational fundamentals. And then my job is to focus on my subject to be able to take those images. What I find in today's market is you got one person who wants to throw 3 lights on set because they found a YouTuber who told them that they should go do that. And they're not focused on their subject. They're focused on the quality of output of those 3 lights that they're using, or even one light that they're using because they're not sure how to master that light source yet. So what matters to me is that you've mastered your lighting technique first. And it's so fundamental, you don't even think about.
That's actually exactly that would have been my next question is, do you think that people, or photographers nowadays often tend to sort of overcomplicate things when it comes to lighting?
Yeah, and I think YouTube has been a huge issue with that, right? Which is most educators now are not photographers, right? Most of the people teaching photography are not professional photographers. They're not making their money off of actual photography. They're making their money from the people watching the content. And so they build things that are interesting. And so effectively, you're trying to mirror something that is not practical. You're trying to mirror something that is entertainment, right? There's a difference between education and entertainment. Entertainment can be educational, and education can be entertaining, but you can't just side on just entertainment. And I think when you see YouTubers jump on there and go, I use this one light, and this is what I do, and really it's the way they communicate. They're not sure. Like, for example, you're wearing glasses. I know for a fact that you have that light source, right? And I can tell by the shadow of your face, right? We have it 45 up. I can tell what the shadow is exactly. I can tell you where your light source is. And I can tell the fact that you have high enough not to have reflection in your lenses. Like, those are things that I can tell. I know the fact that you have another purple light source behind you. I can tell there's a spotlight on the background. Those are all things that, like, I can tell where all the little nuances are. Know your light source, know your craft enough to know how to change the direction and angle of a person's glasses, right? And you find YouTubers that'll say, grab this light, put this light source to the specific amount. You're teaching someone effectively the wrong thing, which is you're not teaching them how to think. You're giving them a formula without context. And so your environment might be different than the person that you saw on some screen in this specific environment. I think it's a lot of the blind leading the blind and other photographers trying to replicate something that they just can't. And that goes with any field, at all. So I would say we overcomplicate things because of all the noise that we get to watch on TV or on YouTube or on our mobile devices.
Yeah, it's a huge issue on YouTube, and that's, again, I said this millions of times, the problem with YouTube in a sense, and this is, I come from an educational background. I used to teach guitar for a very long in schools and, for a very long time. I used to run my own music school for 11 years.
We just came back from Nashville. If you haven't been there, you'll love it.
I Man, Nashville was unbelievable. Unbelievable. But even Vegas, I have to say, like, this is slight excursion into the world of music because, that's what happens on this podcast.
I love it.
Um, there's been for a number of decades now, live venues have been vanishing in London. London used to be famous for its live music, back in the 60s and 70s. And of course, many, many, many world-renowned bands and artists have sprung from London. Everything from the Beatles, technically, I know Manchester, whatever, but actually they made it big in London. Nobody ever. This is another misconception. Like, people talk about Manchester bands. Yeah, okay, they may come originally from Manchester, but they really only make it big in London because this is how the industry works here.
Yeah.
However, over the last 3 decades, I should say, definitely 2 decades, the number of live venues has been diminishing, diminishing, and diminishing, to the point where it's actually quite hard to find any decent live venues in London now, which is terrible. It's terrible for X amount of reasons. It doesn't provide any opportunities for young bands or young artists, for example, as one, because you gotta cut it somewhere, you gotta play somewhere, and if there's nowhere to play, then you got a problem. Um, but it also, it has an impact on commercial music and the kind of drive that we have to listen to in the charts nowadays, not all that kind of stuff. I could go on forever. But and so it's very easy to become really disillusioned when it comes to live music over here at the moment. Okay, and there's a number of reasons why that's happened. One is, of course, property rents have skyrocketed. The gentrification of many parts of London, which has happened over the last few decades. Which has driven out or made it unfeasible for small venues to exist, and lots of noise laws and blah blah blah, noise pollution, yada yada yada. And all that kind of stuff. There's X amount of reasons. But yeah, so it's really quite easy to become disillusioned. However, I have to say, when I went to Nashville, man, was that a breath of fresh air. Going down Broadway and, like, literally having multiple bands sometimes in the same bar,
Mhm.
at every bar all along, all the way down Broadway was fantastic. It was amazing. And I remember like even when I was flying out, right next to my gate as I was waiting for the plane on my departure gate, there was a band. But it's like, I've landed in heaven, man. This is
It's
awesome.
beautiful. It's
Yeah,
just like
fantastic.
it's just so much amazing music.
It's incredible, and the standard as well, this is the other thing. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But, you have to this is the thing, if you want to create, a music scene, and you want to create bands and musicianship, at that level, you're gonna have to give people opportunities to perform. It's as simple as that. And when you live in an environment like unfortunately we do in London at the moment, where these opportunities are dwindling literally by the hour, then that's extremely difficult. And Vegas, I found the same thing in Vegas. It's not quite the same to the same extent, but you walk down the strip in Vegas, and every so often, there's a sports bar with an open front. There's a band playing inside, and it's like awesome. So
So just to tie that analogy quickly, I think the world of photography right now is like if you had a resurgence of musicians trying to learn music. Let's say even let's get really, really specific. You have a bunch of people trying to learn how to play guitar. You got a bunch of YouTubers using the same 3 chords. And they go play this. This is what you need to run a business. It's it. That's all you need.
yeah,
And what would Nashville sound like?
that would sound terrible. That's
Right?
the thing.
Right. So that's where we are as a profession. It's like you got 30 people that go online and say the same exact thing, the same exact way, and none of them have ever played on stage anywhere either. Like these are all theoretical people where they've never, and you find that a lot in the educational space where people don't really have clients, but they'll go jump on YouTube to go teach somebody something. You're like, wait, what? How did you come up with this conclusion? It's a wild space.
Yeah, and this is the other problem, of course, with things like YouTube, where you have so much information, and actually also so much fantastic information stored on this platform. But the problem is when you're first starting out, there's a number of problems. First, as in any discipline, no matter whether you're studying math or physics or biology or whatever, science or art or whatever it is, when you go to school or college or university, you have a learning path that takes you from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. And so you can build on the knowledge that you've already learned. And one of the biggest problems that happens, for instance, let's say in high school, is often that when people develop problems, is because they have, bricks in their Lego house missing. The foundation isn't quite there. And this is often where the problem occurs later on. So being able to lay out a structured learning path is super important. And that's very difficult to do on a platform like YouTube, where each item is 5 minutes long or something, each video, and then it swims in a sea of literally millions of other videos. And so it's difficult to create any structure there. And that's compounded by the problem that when you're a beginner in anything, your biggest problem is that you don't know what you don't know. And it's
I
extremely difficult to find your way through a platform like that.
So I do wish that YouTube had a standardized LMS platform that they had for different users, right? So you can build your own effectively microsite within the site itself, because that would allow most content creators to structure things in a meaningful way. Because right now you're just beholden to playlists, but if you miss specific content in that playlist and things are removed, like you'll never know. So you almost have to build external sites, and then driving traffic to those things is, as you saw with Creative Live, it didn't go so well after a course of years. So it's not structured for success to begin with. But I would love a world where they allow content creators to refine things the right way.
What's also, it's a matter of it's a question of how the search the search engine within YouTube works. Because obviously on YouTube you have a situation where just like any other social media platform in a sense, the platform wants to keep you on the platform, so it will serve you up. It will suggest videos to you, for instance, that are similar to what you've watched or that would correspond with your interests, so to say. instead of basically saying, "Oh, okay, you've just watched this video about skin retouching, so you might be interested in this other video about a different aspect of skin retouching." Because at that point you could go, "Okay, well, I can learn some more about the same subject that I've just been learning about," you know, rather than like, "Okay, well, we know you're interested in photography, dogs, and I don't know, hot rod cars. And so you've just watched this video about skin retouching. Now we're going to suggest some other videos about hot rod cars that we also know you love because we want to
Are you
keep
watching my YouTube playlist? Is that what's happening right now? Are you looking at my history?
No, that's a coincidence. you know, it's
It's
one
a
of these things.
it's a broken system for sure, and it's the way that we're consuming content. You wanna add to that. Website traffic is down 70% on average because of LLMs, things like ChatGPT, right? YouTube content has its own algorithm, and the way that they're producing content. Then you have content like TikTok and Instagram that serve you what they think is best. And so you as a user are constantly getting bombarded with noise on a consistent basis. And so people just aren't sure where to start, right? So how do you do that effectively? Which is why I think it's so incredibly important to find one foundation and really stick with it or practice. It's funny if you're going to start learning about push-ups to go do push-ups and you sat there and you've consumed 10 hours of learning how to do push-ups and you haven't done one, there's an issue there.
It's
Right?
funny that you mentioned that. When I started going to the gym and a little while ago, and my wife, I used to, of course, this is just how my brain is wired. I'm thinking like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym now. So all of a sudden, I'm going to have to basically, become the expert on everything from nutrition to exercise science to all the rest of it. And so originally I spent a lot of time watching like YouTube channels, fitness channels and stuff. And I remember my wife saying to me like, you watch a lot of those kind of videos instead of going to the gym, and it's the same thing. Like the penny dropped at some point. I'm like, okay, maybe I should stop doing that and actually get my ass down to the gym. That might have more of an effect.
So I have a 70 Chevelle sitting in the garage, and if I go to YouTube right now, so just to call myself out here, and I look at the top content that is on my page, I guarantee the first thing that's going to pop up is cars, right? I have not touched my car in 3 years, and there are a bunch of parts sitting in the garage waiting to get installed on it. But I'd rather watch the stupid video than actually work on the car. So I'm guilty too. That's my point.
Yeah. It's a typical thing. I mean, that's the thing. But you're right. I mean, it's the same, and it's exactly the same in photography. You're going to have to ultimately just go out and practice, in order to get better. I used to have this thing when I used to, like I mentioned, I used to run a music school, and I used to teach guitar. I taught guitar for over 25 years.
That's
Um,
amazing.
and I remember having this is one thing, in guitar playing, especially in electric guitar playing,
Hmm.
which is like, lead guitar playing. And I remember having a lot of kids, over the years come to me and they were like, "Oh, um, I can't improvise,
Hmm.
because it's so hard and I just can't do it. I just can't do it." And then once you start to drill down, you all of a sudden you find out it's like, I could just ask like, "Okay, so how much do you practice, every day?" And they go like, "Oh, I play 2 hours every day." And I'm like, "Okay, well, that's a lot. That's actually really good." But when you're practicing, what do you practice? Well, I learn songs and I practice solos and I practice my scales and this and that and the other. But I just don't seem to be able to get the hang of how to improvise. And then when you ask, well, how much of that 2 hours do you actually spend practicing improvisation? They go, well, none because I can't do it. I'm like, okay, well, that's your problem.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to learn how to drive a car by um either playing a racing game on by playing F1 on the PlayStation. That's just not gonna
Yeah.
happen.
Unless it's a simulator seat, which is a whole separate topic. But it's and you still don't
Well,
get the feel for an actual car. But it is what it is. The the alignment there to the photography conversations is this for me. And it's funny because I'm sitting in an area where I know at least, I would say, 4 to 5 aspiring photographers, and these are people that are good enough to at least make money, right? In terms of making that happen. But they're all so junior in the way that they think about their lighting styles and what they're trying to present. It's when you give them structure and you go, here's, one subject in a studio environment, they know what to do. But the second any variable changes, they're not sure what to do at all, and that to me is that comes with experience, right? Being able to go try new things. I remember we did an editorial. I must have been like 24, 25. We flew out to Dubai and we wanted a soft portrait in the middle of the desert. Okay. Midday sun. How do you do that? Well, we have an SUV. Let's open up the tailgate. Let's put her under the tailgate because there's not enough, room anywhere. And we had her like kneel down and we were able to do a portrait for what we needed. And it ended up being soft light. Do you have enough technical expertise to, quote unquote, like you said, improvise? And those are the things that tell me if you're going to be a great photographer or not. Because if not, you're the type of person that goes, this background's ugly. I don't know what to do with it. This lighting situation isn't the best. I don't know what to do with it. I want to figure out, do you have the wherewithal to just think on the fly to adapt to the situation? Like that to me. And that goes back to the curiosity.
Exactly, it's the playfulness. There's a software called Satellite. I think it's called Satellite. I think it's called Satellite. Well, basically, you can simulate different lighting situations. You can kind of build a room and have different lights and modifiers and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, you can, of course, yes, you can plan out your shoots and all that kind of stuff. Basically, go like, okay, I wonder what would happen if I did that. And of course, it only simulates real life, but at least it gives you an idea of what could happen when you do that. And that to me is actually I completely use it as a toy, as a total toy.
This is the cheapest way you can do that. You carry this in your pocket every single day. Okay. If
Yeah.
I put my hand up here, I can figure out, okay, what does the direction look like upwards? What does it look like from below? What does it look like from the side? How does it look like at a 45 degree? What happens if I turn my subject this way? If I bring it back up this way? If I put it in terms of a rim light position, what happens there? I don't need software to do that. It just goes back to genuine curiosity, right? Even something so simple as your phone is something that we can use. I mean, get a flashlight, go. I would rather you do that than jump into a program, because at least you're understanding how to manipulate that with your own two hands.
That's also very
That is that's the cheapest way that you can do it. Go grab a flashlight, and you have a Batman action figure you've had since 1983 somewhere. Go take that and figure out what happens when you put light in a specific position. Because that's replicable when you're going into a studio environment. What you're describing to me is what we talked about before. It's like driving a simulator and trying to learn how to drive an F1 car, right?
yeah.
It's very correlated. So let's get you learning how to drive a Honda Civic before we start teaching you how to drive the F1 car, right? So you need to at least grab something with your hands at bare minimum to practice with.
Now, when you're looking at somebody's face, how do you like what goes through your mind in terms of decision making when you're deciding on how you're going to light a particular person?
Texture is important to me. I don't want to make somebody look over textured, right? I'm not talking about like HDR in somebody's face at all. But let's say if I was taking a portrait of you, I know the hat seems to be of interest to you, so I want to make sure to make that look well on you. You have glasses. I'm not going to run and be like, can you take off your glasses? I don't know how to light those. I don't know how to get the glare out. So
Actually,
they're
I
off.
only wear them. I don't usually wear them. I only wear them because my eyes are really tired today.
That's okay. But even your glasses, right? If those are of importance to you, I want to make sure that I honor you and I'm not making an inconvenience to pull them off. Um, I would set up the light exactly where you have it. If I felt like if I wanted to separate like the subject from, like, those are all things that I want to be able to communicate. And this goes back to the first, we work in a two-dimensional platform, sorry, plane. So I want to make sure that I get as much texture. Like, I love the felt in a hat. Like a good, solid, beautiful hat has that grain in it, those small little felt, those little pieces in it. I love that. The jacket, the denim, what does that look like? Your facial hair, like, I want to make sure to have as much depth as I can there. Even your eyes for expression. I want to be able to capture all those little details, but that comes with knowing how to capture with light and how to place the light in the right way, knowing contrast, because contrast is going to play a huge part of that, knowing how much the intensity of light is going to affect that, my quality of light is going to affect that, knowing the position of light and how that's going to affect, all that is incredibly relevant to trying to capture that image of you. But you master that. And then I sit with you and go, how's life going? How are you doing? Are you having, what are you working on that you're like super passionate about right now? And you go, I'm learning a riff right now. Oh, tell me more about that. And as soon as you get that smart click, right? And then but I've mastered the lighting aspect and I just focus on you.
If if you could only use like one lighting setup for the rest of your career, right? Um, what would that look like?
59-inch parabolic softbox with, and I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. I had a Westcott I loved for a long time with a Profoto, either B1 or D1, depending on which direction you want to go, or sorry, Profoto B1 or B2, and then, sorry, D1 or D2, and then 500 watts of power there, 45 degrees Rembrandt with likely a V flat on the side. Super simple, right? One giant soft light, one giant modifier, call it a day.
And if you do want to learn more about modifiers, especially in a small home studio, I highly recommend you check out my latest Creative Life class that's about to come out. I thought I'd plug that there just a little bit.
Love it.
Anyhow, um, uh, is there something that in your mind kind of separates like a beautiful portrait from um, an effective portrait, let's say?
Context. Where does it live? Where's the end goal? Where is it going to be? Right. My goal is to make sure that I get as much attention as possible, especially in such a noisy market.
This a thing now, I think, especially when it comes to AI, because we're going to have to mention it at some point. Um, I think that especially since AI is becoming better and better, to be honest, um, at rendering portraits. I mean, I did just for the hell of it, um, I did render out some portrait images the other day just because I was planning a shoot and so on. And I was really flabbergasted by how good the final renders actually were. Because to be honest, the last time I tried, I was probably just after ChatGPT had come out or something, and it was terrible back then. Um, like now that AI generated, imagery becomes so much or has become so much more convincing. Um, what is it that's gonna matter in human portraiture?
The entrepreneurs. Let me expand on that. Can you name any seamstress in history from the late 1800s? Name one.
I don't think I can.
Yeah.
A seamstress, I don't know.
And you won't, right? But all the brands that you wear right now, your Louis Vuittons, all those brands, right? Many of those started right around that same period. And they were seamstresses and people that were creating clothing during a time when everything went to sweatshops effectively, right? You went from people that were handcrafting things to people who lost their jobs to machines who no one remembers those people, right? But everyone remembers the few people that said, you know what, I'm going to take these same skills and I'm going to charge a premium for them because they don't exist anymore.
That's an interesting thing. I tell you what, I can't remember. It may have been Gary Hughes
Yeah.
who mentioned that at one point. It's just this comparison between buying shoes at Walmart and buying handmade Italian shoes that are made by like some cobbler, in a tiny little alleyway in southern Italy somewhere. You know, you buy a pair of shoes at Walmart for $10 or something.
Yeah.
Or the way prices are going nowadays, probably more like $50. Who knows? Um, but um, and yet that handmade pair of shoes you happily spend $1,000 for a couple of
Mm.
grands or whatever. It's this perception of quality. And I don't know whether the quality is really better. I mean, just because something's handmade doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily better, but, you know,
It's perceived value at the end of the day,
perceived
right?
value. Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
um, I don't know how much of a car person you are, but when you look at the Bugatti Veyron, which I think the retail value on one of those is $1.1 million, a lot of the parts are from Audi and Volkswagen. I'll say that again. A lot of the parts in the car are from Audi and Volkswagen. You're paying a premium for what? The perceived value
Yeah,
of
of
the
course.
product. And so even all the internals, everything about that car screams Audi and Volkswagen. And if that's the case, I'm paying for a name, I'm paying for a status, and I'm paying for the perceived value of what I'm bringing to the table. So how do you create that is a question. And that goes back to the entrepreneurship. You have to market yourself enough. You have to have enough credibility to justify that investment. You don't want to be the quote unquote Walmart photographer for sure, but that's easy to say. It's difficult to do.
It's also difficult, I think, um, to find your audience in a sense, or your ideal client, because I think that's really what it's gonna boil down to. And I had a conversation very similar to this with a local photographer yesterday. Um, and the conversation went along the lines of like, "Oh, it's so much more difficult now because it seems like, the clientele is is shrinking. People are, for whatever reason, not buying into photography, family photography, and so on, as much anymore. It's becoming increasingly more and more difficult, and I don't know where this is going, blah 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 blah, and all that kind of stuff."
It's all
Um,
lazy. That's all laziness. That's not true.
mm,
I'll give you my answer to that. Here's my thought process there. You're a wedding photographer. Go look up engagement in your city on Instagram right now. Use a photographer, go congratulate those people. What's the first thing people do when they congratulate you on a photo? What's the first thing you go do? Generally speaking, if you're not a person that's narcissistic, you click on that link and you go, oh, who's that person that said congratulations I've never met before? Oh, that person's a photographer. Oh, and they're local. How much did that cost you?
Time, just time, nothing. Yeah,
Just time, right? So instead of sitting there scrolling through Instagram on a Monday night because you have nothing better to do, what's stopping you from using that same time to say, engagement so and so, and let me try to book some weddings, right? I have this conversation with a lot of my students still today, right? So here's another one, and I've said this now for almost 15 years. Okay, I still have had less than one hand of the amount of people who've actually taken this advice. How many times have you gone to Vegas, seen a billboard, and you go, I could do better than that? How many times have you gone down your local street and seen a billboard and say, I can do better than that? How many times have you called that company to tell them that?
that's a very good point.
Right? So there's always opportunity for those that are willing to look at things. Right now, if you're a portrait photographer or if you're a headshot photographer, Yelp, things like ZocDoc. When I look at a dentist, I don't know people who enjoy going to the dentist. There's a few, people that enjoy that, and I question their sanity. But you can Google dentist near me within a 20-mile radius. Go to ZocDoc, go to Google, and see every single dentist in that area that doesn't have a portrait or has one that's even slightly sketchy looking, and call that person. Say, hey, listen, I'm a photographer in the area. Would love to do a portrait. These are my rates. Is that something of interest to you? I think it's going to help you bring in new business. And if you have the credibility to go back and say, look, I've had 3 other dentists in the area, see a bunch of new clients come their way. It's a very different conversation. The problem is most photographers are waiting around for this to start ringing. And that's not the way it works anymore, right? So
Yeah,
you have to go seek those things. So anytime I hear somebody go, there's not enough work and this and that and the other, I don't, when I started photography, and I want to make this very clear, I had a photographer named Lou Freeman. I love her. She was a mentor at the time. She goes, things aren't what they used to be. We used to make $15,000 a day. I don't know. No one makes that anymore. So when I made my first 15 grand in a day, I made sure to say, like, hey, I was able to do it. May not be doing that every single day, the way that she claims to have done back in the day, but it doesn't mean that her reality is my reality. The difference is that I went to go and I looked at my bucket, my lane, and focused on what I needed to go do instead of what other people were saying. And I think most photographers just get into this mindset of, it's easier to complain about there not being work than there is to go look for it, because that's hard.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and I tell you, this is I think there's a number of elements. One, it's often said, and again, it's a complete generalization, is that creative people make bad businessmen, or whatever the mantra is, which is not entirely true, but I think it's probably true more often than it's not. Um, and I tell you what, I had two conversations that really a long time ago really changed my mind. The one was with Joel Grimes. I remember I was talking to Joel, and he was telling me about how we started out,
Yeah.
40 years ago or something. And I remember he said, like, when he said to me, like, look, when I started out, there were loads of photographers in my area, and the first thought that goes through your mind is like, uh, how can I compete with all of them? They seem to be established businesses, so many of them. Is the market big enough? You know, blah blah blah. Um, And he said one of the things that he used to do is he used to have, what do you call it, a Rolodeck type of thing? Where you used to have your like contact cards in it, and a phone book and a phone. And he basically used to put that on his table, like a little camping table in his studio. And he said, like, well, every time he came into work every day, he would spend the first hour just calling businesses, and just doing marketing. And then even when he became more successful in a bigger studio and a big office, he still had the same camping table with the same phone book and the same roller deck and a phone. And he would put that into the entrance to his office to remind him that that was going to be the first thing he would do every day. And then he said, the interesting thing was, over time, over the years, what happened was, of course, there were many photographers that were technically more skilled or more talented or whatever. But the one thing that he could do was outmarket all of them, you know, and that's how he ended up having a career that, spans I was gonna say 4 centuries, sorry, Joel. I mean, 4 decades, probably. Um,
So I want to acknowledge something publicly. Joel is one of the is a dear friend, and I love him wholeheartedly as a human being. Joel's one of the most genuine people you will ever meet. Joel's also one of the only working instructors that I've ever met. Okay. Peter Hurley's second in terms of actual work that they produce, but Joel's number one. And so I have a lot of admiration for him and the Grimes family, for his wife, for his boys, all of them. And I think that they're a blessing to our community. That is a man who has always gone out to find the work, and he is no stranger to literally rolling up his sleeves and getting in there and looking for opportunity. That is a very different human compared to your average photo instructor in our market.
yeah, that's very true. That's very true. The other conversation I had, and it's just exactly the same sort of principle, was, I remember when I first started out to, like I said, to make money with photography. I had a friend of mine who I went to college with and had known her for a long time through music, and she was just starting out. Uh, she's just set up like I think it was like a marketing business or
Mm.
something. And I remember calling her one day, and I was saying to her like, "Oh, so how's it going? You give lots of clients," and she goes like, "Oh, no, not at the moment. No, it's quite slow at the moment." So I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing?" She goes like, "Well, I'm working on my marketing." You know, and immediately I'm thinking, well, it's obviously, because that's what you got to do. Like if you're not working, you need to be working on your marketing. So it's one of these things. The only downside of that, and this is something that I think a lot of people face, especially in the beginning, of their career, when it's only you don't have the funds to pay other people to do other things and outsource things.
Mm.
It's that, you beat the bushes, you get yourself some work, then you actually do the work. And of course, whilst you're doing the work, you can't be doing the marketing at the same time. So it's this valley and trough, whatever the, peak and valley kind of sort of situation where you're either working or you're marketing. Then you're working, can't do any marketing. So you're running out of jobs, and then you're forced to do some more marketing. How do you get out of that trap?
You don't. That's the reality. You don't. And so any great seller is always going to be in that same mindset, right? So look at a salesperson. There's a famous line that goes, you're only as good as your last sale, right? And there's a rationale for that. If I'm working quarter by quarter as a seller, let's say if I'm selling a product, I still have to, as I'm closing business, I still have to think about what my leads look like the next month somehow, some way, right? So it's not about doing one or the other, it's prioritizing. There's in software and in sales, there's called pipeline coverage, if you've ever heard that term. In order for me to make my quota, I need to have at least 8 times my quota to make sure that I meet my quota, or 8x whatever my quota is, right? So no matter what, I'm in that buffer, that 8x, because I know that at least an eighth of them will close, right? And some of them are going to fall off. I need to have as many leads as possible. So you have to juggle selling at the same time you're looking at new pipeline. So how do you do that efficiently and effectively? And how do you do that at scale really becomes the interesting part. Could you use things like how much of your money are you allocating towards running campaigns in your local area? How much time is spent really doing outbounding for your business? What's the most impactful type of outbounding that you're doing? Not asking you to spend, you have 168 hours in a week, right? If you're spending 2 of those actively marketing your business and you do it the right way, you can have just as much impact as spending, or you can have a million times more impact than you spending those 2 hours scrolling through Instagram because it was fun, right? So there's how are you prioritizing your time? Because if you're shooting and you're bringing in new business and you're trying to edit at the same time, I would say, do you need to edit, or can you spend more money on marketing, hire one new client, and offset some of the costs of those, or raise your prices to be able to do that? Like, there are impactful ways to prioritize. Or are you the photographer that goes, no, I want to own everything from start to finish, right? If you, that's a consequence of your choices. And so you choose your heart at that point. So it's about prioritization of your time. I'm not expecting every single person to work. And let me say, I've been there working 100+ hours a week to make ends meet, to figure out where I need to do, right? I'm not asking anyone to put in that many hours. What I am saying is, if you're going to work 40 to 60 hours a week, how are you better prioritizing that time? Are you spending an hour a day reaching out to new people? Most photographers don't have, they don't sell because they don't have pipeline, right? Meaning they don't have 100 active opportunities. And how do you get 100 active opportunities? You reach out to people. So I'm not going to shoot on Monday, and I'm only going to focus on finding outbound leads. I'm not going to do that Tuesday through Friday. And I go to church on Sundays. I'm going to take Sundays off. That's my non-working day. So Saturdays, because I know that I was backlogged throughout the week, I'm going to make more calls or emails on Saturday. Like, it's prioritization of your time, but you're never going to get to a point where you do one or the other until that happens. It's all on you. You're a business owner. And I think that's the thing of going from a hobby to a profession, right? One's one's fun and it's look, not everyone's meant, and I'm going to say this in full transparency, not everyone's meant to run a business. That's okay. You could do photography as a hobby and do it for fun, but not everyone's meant to run a full-time, full-fledged business. Not everyone's equipped for that, right? Because if I was a plumber who just enjoyed plumbing as a hobby, but I was uninterested in paying for the insurance, finding new clients, you would think I was crazy. But because it's an art and it's fun, people want to make it more than it is. No, you're providing a product or service. And if you want to run it as a product or service, you have to run it as a business, and you have to allocate your time the right way.
So, if you could give new
Right.
photographers one specific tip that would enhance their career as a portrait artist or as a photographer just in general, what would that tip be?
Master your craft. That's number one. Master your craft. The close second to that is learn how to run a business.
And that's where I know a lot of people fall short. I had to learn this the hard way because I remember when I first set up my music school, I knew a lot about music and about playing the guitar and about teaching, but I didn't really know anything about running a business. And you know, sometimes you just have to learn it the hard way. Jeff, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. I know we could keep this conversation going for hours. In fact, we could do a complete separate episode just about marketing for photographers, I'm sure. It's been extremely enlightening. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shakes podcast this week.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you.
Okay, folks, that is it for today. Huge thank you to Jeff for joining me on the show today. What a fantastic conversation. I think there were some real gems in there, whether you're photographing clients, headshots, portraits, or just trying to better connect with the people in front of your camera. And as always, before we go, let me recommend another episode I think you really enjoy. If portrait photography and creating connections through your images is your thing, go and check out episode 304 with Clive Booth, how to create cinematic portraits with simple lighting. I'm sure you'll find something right up your street. If you enjoy what we do here, consider supporting the show over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It generally helps us keep creating more conversations. And don't forget, if you'd like to support your excellent taste in photography podcasts, who write this stuff? Camera Shake merch is available now over at camerashakepodcast.com. For those of you listening to the audio version of this podcast, of course, did you know that there's a full video version over on YouTube, complete with examples of our guests' incredible photography in full, glorious Technicolor? Well, you should by now, because I mention it all the time. Just head over to YouTube, search for Camera Shake Podcast, and you will find this episode plus the full back catalog waiting for you there. It's over 300 episodes. I'm sure you'll find something you love. And if you're already watching on YouTube, drop us a comment and let us know your biggest portrait takeaway from today's episode. Hit the like button, ring the bell, share this with your photographer friends. It really helps us reach more creators around the world. So thank you so much for listening and watching. And remember, a brand new episode drops every Thursday. So make sure you mark that in your calendars, diaries, whatever your kids use these days. Until next time, keep shaking things up in the world of photography, and I'll see you next Thursday.